Welcome to the third keynote of our symposium. I've been waiting to have this discussion with a dear friend. I would also say an inspirator, an innovator, and also a polymath doctor who creatively blends his passion for health, innovation, and storytelling to empower positive behavior change in both life and work. And as we know, behavior change is a key component of health coaching. So welcome to day three, Dr. Gautam Gulati.
Thanks for having me, Eugene. Lovely to be here.
Maybe, a little bit, let's obviously give me a little bit more background on yourself, and especially how, the theme of the conference is all about happiness, right? And how you came to start thinking about happiness in your journey, and what made you actually do some more research on it.
Yeah, for sure. So let me first preface and say, listen, I'm not a scientist or a PhD on happiness. I think there's a lot of smart people out there who have tried to solve the issue of defining what is happiness and how do we essentially get there. And so, I think, anything that really gets instigated, I had my first foray into trying to understand what happiness is when I had a traumatic event in my life. And it was not just a traumatic event, and it turned out to be a series of traumatic events. The first event was when I had to sit on the bedside of my father, who was slowly withering away with Alzheimer's and having to write his obituary while he was sort of passing away, and really just sort of getting me understand, not just in thinking about his legacy, but my legacy, and what are we truly living for when we end up hitting our end of life. And so that was sort of my first foray into sort of digging around and probing around some of the different ways of achieving happiness and really reflecting on my own life. Then a few months after that, my mother-in-law ended up having a near-death debilitating stroke. So again, reinforcing this issue of what are we living for? If she can't move, if she can't function, is there no quality of life? And how does it relate to health and our wellness and our well-being? And can you truly be happy living in that form and function with limited capabilities to be able to self-serve? And then a couple of months after that, I myself experienced something traumatically in a physical injury when I was in Africa, and ended up having a horrible knee injury in the middle of a safari that I had to get medevaced out. But a lot of critical decisions that were made in terms of how we are going to achieve and get assistance for help. Is my leg going to be amputated? The impact on my family who was there with me at the time. So a lot of unknown questions. And I actually had about 3 months I was bedridden post surgery. Once I came back to the States. And so of course you have a lot of time to reflect. Mm-hmm. And I started looking into some of the research of Gretchen Rubin and her happiness project. I looked and studied the global National Happiness Index created by Bhutan, the country of Bhutan. Yep. I looked at some of the works of, coming out of the Harvard study in terms of their 75-year study on happiness, and Naval Ravikant. So really, I've sort of pieced together what I believe is my own take on happiness. But, the conversation, of course, pulls in from some of those experts.
Yeah, and maybe let's double click on that, right? Also, when you sort of Google and search on happiness, Tim Urban's definition also comes in, and I'm pretty sure you've come across it. Any comments on that before we dive deeper into others? You mentioned a couple of other things in there that I want to double click on, but let's start with Tim Urban.
Yeah, we can do that. I think in order to understand Tim Urban's, which I can explain in a second, I can probably just give you my take and sort of my culmination of having, coalesced everything I've learned about happiness, and give you my take. And then we can unpack that and talk about the influences, including Tim Urban's, and how all of those fit into sort of my take of happiness. So the way I see it is happiness ultimately is a state of being, right? So what is that state of being? Of course, my perspective and angle always comes from the health angle. So the state of being for me is the physical, emotional, and spiritual elements that go into happiness, right? And so happiness also, then if I layer it down another level, is not binary. It's not either I am happy or I'm not happy. It sort of falls on a spectrum. And that spectrum varies by individual based on their individual circumstances and their experiences. And that can fluctuate and change over time, right? So happiness does not have to be something static. the defining factors can actually change over the course of time, depending on young, old, different circumstances, where I am in my life, et cetera. And then thirdly, the spectrum is essentially influenced by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors, right? Things that happen within inside me and things that are influenced by the outside. So that's kind of how I see happiness in terms of defining it. And I think the inputs are very different for individuals. And then we can talk about, some of the ways people like Naval Ravikant or Tim Urban or some of those guys think about happiness. And as you mentioned, Tim Urban actually, I love his simplistic definition of happiness, which is happiness equals reality minus expectations.
Yep.
Let me repeat that. Happiness equals reality minus expectations. And I think that's very accurate. I don't think that's the only way to define happiness. I think that's a component of it, but I certainly do believe that his take on it is true as well.
It's interesting. You always have the motto of kind of under promise and over deliver, right? And I think that, yes, that's on the business side, but if you think about your own days, right? We also, that this is how I look at it. Personally, it's, we all kind of ebb and flow throughout the day. And, if you also setting your expectations high is a good thing, but also, can you even to yourself kind of under promise? And this is kind of to the definition of, there's things that happen to us and how you react to that, right? And back to your intrinsic motivation and the extrinsic parameters that kind of happen to it. So,
well, I mean, I like that notion because that basically tells me that, according to the way you define it, as there are things that happen to us. Happiness to some degree is a choice, right? Yeah. Because how we react to certain things can frame whether we look at it in a positive or negative way, and how we know that how we frame things can essentially impact our emotional state, right? So we can both look at the same thing. I can frame it positive, one person can frame it negative. To achieve happiness, you have to understand how to view that world and from that positive standpoint and perspective.
And maybe you mentioned the happiness study, the Bhutan happiness study. Maybe just for our viewers and listeners, you can kind of double click on that and give a little more details on that, because that's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I'm certainly not a historian buff, so there's probably things that I'm going to miss. But the summary of it is essentially, Bhutan was one of those countries that was not up until recently still living in a very basic medieval way, right? So up until the 1960s, dirt roads, not much electricity or running water, things like that. So it wasn't until the 1960s where the leadership started creating this framework for the development of the country of Bhutan, which is only about 700,000 people, I believe. So a very controlled environment, rooted in nature, surrounded by Tibet, China, and India. And it's beautiful country. And they looked at the West and these other countries and said, everyone's defining their progress based on GDP, right? Gross domestic product, or gross national product, GNP. And we believe that, yes, money and wealth is a key component to success, but it's missing this element of happiness. And so they created, at that time, I don't know who it would be, the emperor, the king, or whatever they define it over there, created the gross national happiness index. And including in those surveys was measuring elements of happiness based on, social connectivity, based on your emotional states, based on different surveys and questions that they asked. But they incorporated that into the design of the country of Bhutan. Now, a lot of people commended them for trying to achieve that, but it's easier said than done.
Of course.
And I'm not sure that they exactly solved for it, which opens up a whole different discussion of what works and what doesn't work in terms of defining happiness. And can you actually create happiness, or is this something, can you create the environment for happiness, or is this something that intrinsically is practically impossible? Because they are struggling with it for sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's not, and we always have the studies as well, or the surveys, right? In the Nordic countries come up top typically, right? So, And it's interesting how everything from the definition of it, and I loved your sort of comments as we're going through and exploring happiness. What does that mean to an individual and a country, right? Those could be very, very differently, and that's the scale challenge. Since we are on the subject of people, and we've used this term in the last 2 days through some of the panel discussions, et cetera, the Great Resignation, right? I think COVID in the last 2 years and still ongoing has put many pressures on us extrinsically, right, as individuals. Maybe you can talk a little bit about happiness in the context of that Great Resignation and what you're seeing, hearing, and your sort of compilation of that to the happiness.
Yeah, I think there was, for sure. I think there was an interesting tweet. I think it was last week, I believe by Tim Ferriss, but he said people would prefer grossly being unhappy over uncertain. And I think there is some correlation between the two anyways, but
couple of weeks ago, I've seen that. That's right.
Yeah, you saw that same tweet. And I just thought it was fascinating. I saved it. I'm still trying to unpack it and determine what the correlation is between the two. But certainly in the form of the Great Resignation, I think what we saw during the period of this pandemic was similar to my experience of being bedridden for 3 months post-injury. I think, as kind of a similar metaphor analogy, I think COVID, what made us all bedridden to some degree. We all had time to sit back and reflect on the things that mattered most in our life. And it actually provided this sort of national editing process that we all went through in our lives, right? Like we started to realize that our weekends were so packed before COVID, and all of a sudden we've got all this time on our hands. We're like, we're still doing okay. And in fact, we're still happy without all of those things and having our schedules filled and going into the office. And, I think we came to this universal realization as a country and as basically as a species that we kind of needed this pandemic editing process of our lives to say what is absolutely necessary to keep us going, keep us motivated, keep us happy. And what are the things that were just unnecessary? And I think that is causing to some degree this, Great Resignation. I think we're probably going to, shoot the pendulum a little bit too much. People are going to start to realize that they have to make a living and come back. But at the same time, it's getting people to think about what really matters in their lives. Is it flexibility? Is it freedom? Is it the money? Is it being close in vicinity to the people that you care about? I think all of those are coming in question. And I think the bigger challenge is going to be companies having to figure out what are the behavioral changes as a result of the pandemic that now the workforce is essentially going to have to adapt to attract those types of talent.
And it's interesting, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the balance because you kind of said, pendulum will swing one way. But just, a quick comment. I mean, we're seeing kind of in our network of health coaches, it's very much of I'll say gig economy profession and becoming more so. We have nurses that are leaving the hospitals because they realize they can't help people anymore inside the healthcare system and becoming health and wellness coaches to help somewhat outside of it, even though the two worlds are now coming together. But, maybe just touch on it. And that's a little bit of the interesting portion. I mean, there are coaches that are working full time, but are now swinging more towards this, freedom of working with their own clients, et cetera. Talk to us a little bit more about what does balance look like in this world, right? Especially Great Resignation, post-COVID. At some point, we'll be officially post-COVID in a sense that from a pandemic declaration, not necessarily it's going away anywhere, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think balance is going to be different for different, for different people. It depends on sort of what they're prioritizing. Yeah. And we've always talked about this element of work-life balance. I think that delineation is essentially disappearing. I think work-life is a single word. It's almost like a one-word
it's just
scenario
life.
Now. It's just life. and life. Work is a part of that. And yep. I think, this notion of having, life coaches, health coaches, well coaches, whatever it is that you want to define, is going to, expand exponentially over the next couple of years for sure. And that's because people are trying to figure out what that balance is. And it's one thing to be self-aware, but it's another thing to essentially develop, reflect on yourself and develop your own strategy. You almost need that third party perspective to come in there and say, okay, it might be hard for me to see all of the challenges that I am living with, but for
Yep.
somebody else, they can come in and basically give me an honest, truthful perspective of what my life looks like. And getting set in that direction, from some sort of coach, at least to set me on the right path, I think is going to be needed more and more so by different families across the country. Yeah.
Before we go into, you are a doctor, before we go into more of a scientific view of this, as a matter of fact, and I know you and I have discussions around, get your own board of directors, right? And I think as life got reset, and I would even say individual happiness standards got reset or relooked at, maybe talk a little bit about what do you mean by that, as far as the board of directors for yourself?
Yeah. So this is actually something I can't really, claim that I came up with as a board of advisors, but my good friend, Dr. Alex Haddad, who spends a lot of time at the end of life dealing with end of life patients, he and I are having this conversation. He said, listen, I've got a board of advisors who keeps me in check year round. And that board of advisors for him consists mostly of his family. But they sit around every quarter and they talk about what's working, not working, and how can they improve themselves. But you can also extend that to other people around you, right? You can extend it to friends, you can extend it to colleagues, and just sort of get a unbiased perspective and honest take on how you're operating in life, right? Are you doing things right? Could you be doing things better? Are you kind? Are you giving enough gratitude? All the things that are important to you, you can use your board of advisors as sort of a checks and balances to ensure that you're on the right path before things get astray. One of the things, I mean, we've tried it a couple of times with our family. Our kids were still a little bit young to truly grasp the concept, but we still do an annual editing process. So my wife and I, for our New Year's resolution, rather than coming up with resolutions, we actually sit down and say, what are the things that we can live without? And part of happiness for us is simplifying our life. We always felt that the simpler it is, the happier we are. So at the end of the year, we tend to accrue things that we're doing, people that we're meeting, and we put all of these stresses on our lives. So we have this editing session at the beginning of each year and say, okay, these are the things we're now going to remove. We're going to start somewhat tabula rasa and then move forward from there. And it does require this sort of annual reflection on terms of things that are important and not important in life and where to say no.
You bring up a super interesting point, right? Because that all requires change. And, while people love to innovate, they hate change. And I know, again, you and I have had many of these discussions. And if you think about it as a family unit, I love the concept of the resolutions. You turn that and say, it's editing. But that requires behavioral changes for you as a family and sticking to them and setting those goals with that. So let's let's peel the onion. So what does that actually mean from a happiness perspective on, as a doc, more on the neurochemical angle of all of this, right? Let's get to a little bit more science sort of behind it.
Yeah, let's dig into some of those. So before I jump into sort of the neurochemical aspects, of course, of happiness, I mean, change is a scary word, right? For a lot of people. And of course, we're in the world of innovation. So change for us is just natural. We don't get scared by it, but most of the world does. And we kind of need that checks and balances again. You don't need the whole world to be innovators and to be disruptors and to be change makers. You just need them to be able to adopt the changes that we recommend, right? Make it easy for them to be able to do that without having that element of fear of change, right? So I don't expect, for example, my wife is, completely different in terms of being risk averse and not liking change and so forth. I'm the opposite. I love change and I embrace risk. But at the same time, we both move towards the same goals that we had set. But it's biology, right? Like why, I'm going to talk about this in some of my talks all the time. We tend to gravitate when we're faced with uncertainty and change, our biology wants us to gravitate towards the mean, right? We find safety in numbers. And that's kind of what we're experiencing in the world as well, right? That's why these companies and startups, et cetera, have tough challenges in trying to get behavioral adoption, because most people are very resistant to change, right? But I think we all know that. Getting into the neurochemical parts of things, and I think that actually circles back with why Bhutan is having some challenges here as well. There's different factors involved with the neurochemical aspect of happiness. One is, of course, and we'll talk about all four of these and we can unpack it, but there's dopamine, right? Dopamine, of course, is the things that we all hear about right now in terms of those quick wins. We want those small wins, those small hits. It's the small tweet, that right, on the Instagram. But then there's also the oxytocin component. And the oxytocin component is sort of the feel good aspect of things, right? It's the hug, it's the love, it's the compliment. It's the reason we like surrounding ourselves with children or pets or things like that, right? That's the oxytocin component and the feeling aspect of happiness. Then we have the serotonin aspect, which is sort of the adrenaline element of things, right? So taking a walk in nature, being outdoors more, getting a run in, having those types of activities also contribute to our happiness. And lastly, there's the endorphin piece, right? It's the being around friends and laughing, and it could include exercising as well as part of the endorphins, or eating certain types of foods. So it's not either or. I think all of these different neurochemicals play a factor in terms of our overall happiness, but we tend to focus mostly these days on the dopamine piece, simply because we've got all of these little gadgets surrounding us, pinging at us, and
the instant gratification, right? And I think the danger that we're all in, and is that those dopamine surges are mistaken for happiness, right?
yes, totally agree. And in fact, it's funny because you look at from 2006 onward, if you look at some of the research, so Bhutan had been doing the Global National Happiness Index and studying their outcomes from 1970 or 72 onward, and there was a complete shift starting in 2006. Mm-hmm. So what happened in 2006 is they started adopting Western technologies and Western food bases and all these different things. So people all of a sudden are glued to the internet, they're glued to their phones, they're glued to all these different social media platforms, and their happiness index started to decline. So there was definitely this correlation between, the devices that we use and our level of happiness. And I think that needs to be correlated when we talk about like this importance of having health coaches. It's having some sort of a device diet that might be required down the road in order to ultimately achieve happiness.
You brought this back as far as even kind of goal setting, and back to a little bit of what you do as a family and editing things, right? The interesting part is you can't prescribe any of this, and that's what coaches don't prescribe anything, right? At the end of the day, it's around understanding your goals. In your case was as a family, and this is in case of a client coach relationship, right? But there's also the reverse, right? So I think we've talked about as a society now everything from lack of sleep to overall I'll say well-being status, and the reverse, the unhappiness drives a lot of that. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that, kind of what and how in our physical health and well-being. After all, we are at a health and well-being coaching conference here.
Yeah, well, I mean, the correlation between physical health and our well-being is not just a mental state. I mean, we can see the implications in our bodies, right? So there's this great book, perfectly called. It's called Heart, written by Sandeep Johar. He's a physician himself and a writer for the New York Times, and it was really fascinating because we were having this discussion around how literally your emotional state impacts the physical nature of your heart. Like it's basically it's a physical blueprint of your emotional state. If you're stressed, your heart feels it. If you're happy, your heart feels it. And so you can apply that across your entire body system, your human system. So how you fall on that spectrum, and it's not just happiness. I think happiness is part of that emotional state of well-being, can impact different parts of your body, right? So there's stress on breathing, there's stress on our brains, there's stress on our heart, there's stress on our muscle. All of these different things are essentially a physical bio imprint of the emotional states and the well-beings that we are, and we tend to keep these as separate elements. So clearly, just as like this whole movement of food as medicine by people like William Lee and Mark Hyman and a number of others, the same thing here. As we focus sort of on our mental well-being, that is also part of medicine, because if we can heal that element, we can also heal our immune system and heal better in our physical bodies as well. And they're very intercorrelated, but we tend not to think of it that way.
I'll grab onto the word you said, flow state, and I think many people in the healthcare profession are looking at a lot of this as cuckoo voodoo science sometimes. But I think there's early evidence emerging, everything from flow state, gratitude, purpose. So I'm going from dopamine to now, let's call it feelings, right? That are now being able to be quantified and studied. Can you talk a little bit more? So kind of double click on you started with flow state, but gratitude, purpose, and importance of that in happiness.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are all some of those, like I talked about, the intrinsic and extrinsic factors that contribute to the spectrum of happiness. I think, there's clearly, I mean, we have research and science and evidence around some of these individual things. There's clearly science that shows individuals who practice gratitude tend to have better emotional states and well-beings, which then tend to have better physical well-being as well. Same goes for those who can achieve flow state. Same goes for those who have better social connections, right? This great book by Vivek Murthy, I believe was called Together, talking about the loneliness epidemic and how that's contributed to our physical demise in terms of our health and well-being. So I think taken all together, there is no true evidence to say like, listen, we're going to, flow state, gratitude, purpose, connectedness, all of that, improves the physical well-being. But I think we'll get there, right? This is kind of like, if you look at food as medicine, that was initially called, functional medicine or integrated medicine, that was considered quack medicine not long ago, right? 7 to 10
Yep.
years ago, that we were all calling it quack medicine. Now it's real science. And I think we're probably going to see more and more of the same here in this space as the studies start to unfold and truly show real benefits. The problem is we don't know what to measure, right? I think that's a big challenge too.
Yeah, I mean, look, we did as your coach when we sort of came onto the scene, we did a pretty large report, and we did parse through. I mean, there's something like almost 200 clinical trials, sort of with and without health and wellness coaching, surrounding everything from therapeutic areas, et cetera. And so, to your point, I mean, we are starting to see science behind a lot of the techniques, which has been around. So. Maybe let's go a little bit about, as we're talking about health and wellness coaching, a key component of this is, I think, as you identify your goals and set certain parameters for yourself, at the end of the day, it's about showing up as well as an individual and forming or changing your habits because health and wellness coaches are agents of behavioral change. So maybe talk a little bit about happiness and creating habits and how those two correlate.
Yeah, I think they're very intricately tied. I mean, I always like to say that our habits are informed by our inhabitats, how we inhabit our homes, right? Our habits are formed by how we inhabit our homes, and you can extend that even further. Our habits are formed by how we inhabit our surroundings. But clearly, bad habits lead to bad things. Good habits lead to good things, right? I mean, I think there's this direct correlation. So we know that if happiness is a choice and it's something that you can actually practice, and you have to work at it. And just like any other type of outcome that you're looking to achieve, you can create habits that encourage better happiness. So if you know what the inputs are, let's say intrinsically, we talk about flow state, we talk about gratitude. Let me see, I think I've got, look at this. So I'm going to step for a second. I mean, things like this. So I've got these little index cards, and I send these out to certain people every now and then. And these are tokens of gratitude. And it makes me feel good. It makes the other person feel good. But these are some of the intrinsic factors that we can essentially create habits that form happiness. And I think for everybody, for every individual, it's going to be different in terms of what those habits need to be. And I think that's where coaching can really come into service in terms of helping identify, here are some things that you can put into practice, over time, develop some happiness, and we can see if it improves your happiness over the course of time. But then there's also the extrinsic factors, right? So for me, I'm a doctor who's strayed from actually seeing patients and working on the business side, but with a family of doctors, and a whole network of people who are friends that were also doctors. That of course took a toll on my psyche in terms of my personal happiness, because I felt like I wasn't living up to other people's expectations of what they expected of me. But the minute I stopped focused on things like that and created habits to essentially be self-aware and focus on my own well-being versus being worried about what other people thought of me, by creating those habits made me happier as well.
So you mentioned again, obviously, as a doctor and being in a family of the doctors, the big question here is, can you be sick and happy, right?
For sure. Absolutely. I mean, I think it even ladders up to this question. Let's say, for example, I mean, there were some great studies, even again, from my friend Alex Haddad, who's trying to go around and study positive health behavior around the world. Um, he dealt with a lot of cancer patients, and he always found it really interesting, the fact that you could be with stage 4 cancer and have 5 months to live and still consider yourself healthy. And the reason why they considered themselves healthy, right, is because happiness was a big factor and component in terms of how they were defining their health. It didn't necessarily have to mean that I was in the best physical shape of my life, but they prioritized happiness or their well-being as one of the key components of defining their health. And so, can you be sick and happy? Absolutely. So it's funny because even when I had my injury, and I didn't, everyone, kept, saying, you felt sorry for me or felt bad. And I actually felt the happiest at some point during my injury, because it actually forced me to sort of live in this new reality, where I ended up defining my own personal mantra called "Go Be Do," and we can talk about that separately. But that to me was like, yes, I wasn't in the best health shape of my life. I had this debilitating injury. I lost a lot of things that I couldn't do. I couldn't run around my kids at the time. But I would say that, I had entered this period where I actually felt happier than before. So
But
can you be happy and sick? Yes.
You can't leave us all hanging. Go Be Do.
So Go Be
Go a
Do
little deeper on that.
So this is kind of related to my annual edit in terms of what matters in life to me. But Go Be Do stands for go to interesting places, be with interesting people, and do interesting things. And so for me, being faced and bombarded with a lot of input, a lot of things coming at me, a lot of opportunities. Can we do this? Get involved with this. So I needed a filter in my life to determine what things I'm going to say yes to and what things I'm going to say no to. And I define that filter by things that make me happy and unhappy. And so I am happiest, right, when I'm surrounded by things that make me interested.
Yep.
Right. And so for me at this point in my life, and that might change in 5 years or 1 year or 10 years, and it was probably different 5 years ago, but for me, my filter is on everything interesting. So if I'm not going to go to places that I'm not interested in going to, right? I'm not going to waste my time. I'm not going to be with people that aren't interesting to me or have an interest in things that I have to say to them, right? And I'm not going to do or get involved with anything that I don't personally feel is interesting. And so if it doesn't fit that filter, that's my easy no.
Amazing. I'll second that for sure and for all of us. But maybe
and circling back to the habit piece of that. So initially I wasn't staying true to the Go Be Do filter. So what I did is I created a T-shirt and a hat and a bunch of all this stuff to remind me everywhere I look is Go Be Do. And so it created this habit of now utilizing that filter in everything that I evaluate. And again, I created the habit in order to, achieve what I was trying to achieve in terms from a goal perspective.
I want to touch on one subject that I know you and I have spoken about, and we've talked about everything from not here, but in general as a conference, as your coach, we talked about food as medicine, laughter as medicine. I want to actually double click because you kind of in your Go Be Do, it's interesting things and stories, right? And I know I've gotten addicted to your Superhuman podcast.
Thank you.
And it is a fascinating way to experience people's lives and their unhappiness, but also happiness and as they achieve. Talk to us a little bit about stories as medicine. And especially how these stories can actually build, happiness for us as human beings.
I related to all of those personal experiences that I had, I came to this realization that, especially when I had my injury, I felt like I was very alone, to be honest. And I felt like, no one else can really relate to me and undergo and what I've gone through. And as I started digging more into stories. And of course, as someone who gives keynote talks, by nature, and you too, we're both storytellers, right? We love to share lessons based around stories. But what I realized is, stories are a way for us to connect, right? Oftentimes we're lonely because we feel that there's someone else who can't relate to what I'm going through. And this is especially the case in healthcare, right? We feel that we're alone in our experiences or the issue that we're going through. But the reality is, it's not just from a condition standpoint. We're all going to experience these different hardships and challenges. And so stories give ourselves permission to see ourselves in other people's stories. And so that's the purpose of what Superhumans is about. Like, yes, an individual is sharing their story, but now me listening to it, I no longer feel alone. Like, oh, someone else is going through it and someone else that I can relate to. And now it gives me permission to have a dialogue or a conversation about it without putting blame on myself or making myself vulnerable. And so we felt like, as we were putting out these stories, it was having a greater and greater impact with individuals and listeners who were listening to it that we didn't even realize was the case when we first put it together. And in fact, it was actually having a personal impact on us personally creating it. I mean, people giving you the gift of opening up their personal lives was the greatest gift we could ever ask for. And so, Superhumans, I think prescribing stories as a form of medicine needs to be done more and more so, because I think we can all collectively heal if we just had more open dialogue, especially about some of the things that we consider, that are being stigmatized in this marketplace. But it's great to see, less and less of this, or more and more of destigmatization happening in terms of mental health and the conversation opening up around there. So we're just hoping to play a small piece in that.
No, and we will absolutely share the link to Superhumans to our amazing global audience here. We're coming somewhat to an end of our discussion here, even though I think I can talk for hours, and you and I do. But maybe, I always wish on people's birthday, I wish people just health and happiness, because most of the rest of the things can just be simply bought, right? And I think, we've just talked now for quite a while about, health and wellness as coaching and behavior changes and all of that, reaching the happiness levels that we all want to be. I know you also have a favorite Mark Twain's line. So maybe just, in the last couple of minutes, just go through that and what that means to you. And I think how that actually touches on happiness and what can people take away from our discussion.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. It's actually a quotation that I mentioned at the tail end of my TEDx talk from 2012, and it still sticks with me today. But Mark Twain said the two most important days in your life are the day that you're born and the day you discover why. And I completely agree with that. And I think that circles back to this element of what's your purpose and meaning. Now that I'm, way above 40s now, I think the latter half of my life, if I were to consider that the latter half of my life, you start to think about these things, right? You're starting to face with mortality. You're starting to see sickness in your own self. Most of us, or many of us, have kids. So you're starting to see sort of this element of what is the purpose of life? Why am I here? And it's sad to see. I think a lot of people go through life never understanding that why. They sit on their deathbed at the end of life and they live a life full of regrets. And so for me, that is probably my biggest fear. I don't want to be at the end of life, which could be next week, right? It could be next week. It could be next month. It could be 5 years. It could be 50 years from now. Whenever that time period comes, I don't want to live a life full of regrets. And so for me, what's at the top of my pyramid is health and happiness, because without that, nothing else actually matters. Does it matter how much wealth I have? Does it matter all the material things that I surround myself with? Like all of the health and happiness, if you don't put up that as a priority of your focus, which include minimizing life's regrets and eliminating some of that suffering, then nothing else really matters. So that should be the focal priority for almost everyone on this planet. We tend not to really focus on it until, some big struggle in our life. The younger kids tend not to focus on this type of stuff. But again, we could, help, set the environment for them to try to achieve this sort of optimal state of happiness.
So the tagline of the conference is "Healthy, Happy Human." And I know we just spent 40 minutes or so talking about it. What does that mean to you, Dr. G? Happy, healthy, human.
A healthy, happy human, I mean, it's peace with self.
Love it.
I think that is, and that's a very individualized state, right? I think we talked about, I can't, sit here and tell you this is the answer and the definition of how to achieve happiness. I think anyone who claims that they can is blowing smoke. I think to every individual it's different. I think what we can do is try to understand the different components of it, and individualize on that and have a lot of self-awareness. But once you come to sort of that self-awareness of peace, that I'm happy with the things that where they're going, and if I were to die tomorrow, I'm happy with the things that I'm doing today, and I would die in peace as a result of that. So starting with that mortality piece in mind, of knowing that you could die any second, are you satisfied and happy with the way things are right now at this very moment? And if not, start to make some changes. And if you don't know how to make the changes, get the right coach to help you to do that.
Perfect. And on that note, thank you very much for joining us for a wonderful conversation. And for all the viewers and listeners to this, enjoy the rest of the day here with us at the Global Health and Wellbeing Coaching Symposium.
This was fun. Thanks for having me, Eugene.